So welcome. I've got a real treat today. The Center for American Progress has been in Alabama most of this week looking at history of civil rights, the legacy of civil rights and civil rights leaders, also voting rights and what's been happening in our country with regard to voting rights and how we seem to be backsliding. But one of the things that we've been doing is not just talking to the activists who are on the ground now, but trying to talk to those who actually lived that history and developed that history, and whose legacy and whose shoulders we stand on today to try to build for the future. And one of those I have the great privilege of interviewing this afternoon, and that's attorney Fred Gray from Tuskegee, Alabama. We are here in Tuskegee at the Tuskegee History Center to talk to Fred, who has just gotten a remarkable career. I'm not going to go through all of his career. The couple of things I wanted to tell you, though. He was the attorney for Rosa Parks and the attorney for Dr. Martin Luther King. In 2022, I had the honor of being at the White House when he was awarded the Medal of Freedom by President Biden. Fred, we've known each other for a long time now. This is the first time we've had an opportunity to talk. So welcome on behalf of the Center for American Progress. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Doug. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the Center for making it all possible, and appreciate you asking me to be able to talk to these people who want to know something about what has taken place in Alabama, this country, particularly since the Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1955.
Well, that's a good place to start. I mean, I know that your history probably goes back before then, but let's talk a little bit about the Montgomery Bus Boycott. But even before that, you represented a lady named Claudette Colvin. Most people know Rosa Parks, but I don't know how many people know about Miss Colvin. Let's start with her.
Well, Claudette Colvin was actually my first civil rights case. On the 2nd of March in 1955, she was on a bus going from downtown home from school in the afternoon. And the Black History Month had just ended in February. She lived in an area known as King Hill, the northeastern part of Montgomery, and they had to use the public transportation system. So they would get a bus there, go downtown, transfer, and go out to Booker Washington, the high school. On this particular day, the teachers had a teachers meeting. So the students got out early, which meant that the bus they would normally get going home, they were on an earlier bus. They decided to walk from Booker Washington to the Capitol, where the Capitol Heights bus came, or Highland Garden bus, I think it was. And then they would walk to the Capitol, get on the bus. When they got on the bus, there was quite a few of these students. And they knew that the rule was, whether it was a law or not, that the first 10 seats in the bus was reserved for whites, whether they came or not. When they got on the bus at the Capitol, went down Dexter Avenue, got to the square, and before going down Commerce Street, a lot of white people came in. They took up all of the 10 seats, and then as the next seat was needed, the bus driver would ask them to go up the seat. Claudette was sitting not in the second seat, or the third seat, but a seat right in front of the real entrance to the bus, or exit. And when they got to her, 2 other students and a lady got up, gave her a seat, and Claudette didn't get up.
How old was she at the time?
She was 16.
Yeah, she was a teenager.
Years old. She was 16 years old. And the bus driver asked her if she'd get up. She said no. She said, I'm not in the reserved seats for whites, and I have a constitutional right to sit here. And she didn't. He drove a little farther, called a police officer. They arrested Claudette, took her to jail. She called her minister, who was Reverend Johnson at the Hutchinson Street Baptist Church, about getting her out. He got Mr. Nixon, who was Mr. Civil Rights in Montgomery.
That's E.D. Nixon, right?
E.D. Nixon,
Nixon.
that's correct. And E.D. Nixon, after helping to get her out of jail, I told them about this young lawyer, Fred Gray, who had just been admitted to the bar in September before this February. And I ended up representing her in that case before Judge Hill, who was a juvenile court judge in Montgomery. They charged her with being a delinquent and in effect resisting arrest. When I went and talked with her and filed my little motion before Judge Hill and said that really they were charging her with a delinquent in that she had failed to move when the officer told her to move. But I said what they were really trying to do was to enforce the segregation laws requiring the segregation of races on the buses, and I believe it was unconstitutional. He listened very attentively, found her to be delinquent, and declared that she was a ward and placed her in the custody of her parents, which meant that if she behaved herself, she wouldn't get into any problems. I represented her, we appealed the case. Joanne Robinson, who was an instructor at Alabama State and who had some problems on the buses and who was then the chairperson of the Women's Political Council, which was a black organization of educated women, most of whom were teachers at Alabama State, had a similar problem on the bus earlier. And she arranged for a meeting with the bus company officials and the city officials, and I was there as the lawyer. And they said that they were sorry that this incident happened, and they didn't think it would happen again. In the meantime, I had met, and when I was a student at Alabama State, and before I decided to go to law school.
Let me ask you something about law school real quick
Okay.
before we get there, the next
Okay.
step. You had to go outside of Alabama to go to law school. I think you went, was it Case Western?
That's correct.
Had to go outside because,
Of course, you're talking now about 1951.
right,
When I finished Alabama State, and everything was segregated then, because Brown versus Board of Education hadn't been decided. However, cases involving discrimination in higher education and professional schools had been decided by earlier cases. But in any event, the southern states at that time had a plan where black students who had finished Alabama State or Tuskegee was not a state-supported school, but related, and Alabama A&M, that if they finished there, were accepted to these other schools, then they would pay a portion of their tuition, room and board, and their transportation costs. I applied for that and ended up, after deciding to go to law school, and that's another whole story.
right.
But now where were we?
I just wanted to make sure we got to the fact that at the time, black students could not go to law schools in Alabama, but it was a different form of separate but equal when they were paying tuition to go out of state. Would that be a fair assessment?
That is correct. And there was a case decided a long time ago, 1939, I think it was Gaines versus U.S. was the case, and they had used that up to that point.
Well, you were going to bring us forward a little bit with Miss Robinson and the other women in Montgomery that had been complaining about the treatment on the buses after Miss Colvin's arrest.
Yes, well, after Miss Colvin's arrest, and after I had, of course, I've already said that she was my first client, but another thing was I knew Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks I had met while a student at Alabama State, and she was one of the ones, along with E.D. Nixon and Professor Pierce at Alabama State, who said we need some lawyers. We ought to be one to help us solve the problems, particularly the problems on the buses. So they'd been working on that. And after Claudette's arrest, and after I opened my office, and I opened that office shortly after September the 7th, 1954, when I was admitted to the bar, which incidentally, and there's so many little things that
Yeah,
come
I
up
know.
together, is I was admitted to practice law on the 7th of September, 1954. Guess what? Dr. Martin Luther King became pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church the Sunday before that.
Things happen for a reason, Fred.
That's
Things
right.
happen for a reason.
That's right. And it also developed that the same group later on who selected Dr. King in his absence to be the spokesman for the group, in that same meeting selected me to be the lawyer for the movement. And all of that was a result of a meeting that took place after Mrs. Parks' arrest in Mrs. Joanne Robinson's home on Carey Street in Montgomery, Alabama. That's a long, short story. And all of that is set out in my autobiography on Bus Ride to Justice. Joanne Robinson and I, after Mrs. Parks' arrest, and I had been meeting with Mrs. Parks, she would come to my office, which was a block and a half from where she was working, and have lunch each day. And we talked about the problems. We talked about Claudette Colvin. And while I was ready to file a lawsuit when Judge Hill declared that she was a delinquent, our black community wasn't quite ready then. But after I was admitted to the bar, Mrs. Parks was one of the hostesses at my open house. That was before lawyers could advertise like they're doing now. We had these meetings and we talked about all these problems. We talked about Claudette's case. We talked about everything was completely segregated, including schools, and something needed to be done about it. And we had our last meeting, guess when it was? December 1st, 1955. She came, we talked. I told her I was going out of town for an appointment that evening, and she left and went back to work. When I got back from out of town, I had all kinds of phone calls and messages, including one from Mrs. Rosa Parks, in which I knew then, and I had been told that Mrs. Parks had been arrested. I called her. She wanted me to come to her house, talk to her, and she retained me. And I said, that's fine. She told me what happened. This was on Thursday evening. Her case was going to be the following Monday in the Recorder's Court of the city of Montgomery. And I told her, well, I'll get back in touch with you between now and then. But let me just mention this to you, and that is that Joanne Robinson, Professor Robinson, really want to get the community involved. We're going to take care of your case, but it's going to take a while. Let me go and talk to Mr. Nixon, who's a Pullman car porter. And he's in town 3 days, he's out of town 3 days, and he'll be leaving tomorrow, going to Chicago, and won't be back until Saturday. So any plans that's going to be made, they're going to have to be made then. She said, well, that's fine. I said, well, you've done your part. I went to Mr. Nixon, told him about my conversation, and I've been retained by Ms. Parks. And he said, well, you go on and talk to Professor Robinson. You all tell me what you decide, but if you're talking about some mass action, you're going to need to let me know so I can let the other black leaders know and let the preachers know so we can do something between now and Monday. I went on to Joanne Robinson's house and sat in her living room, and we made the plans for the Montgomery Bus Boycott. She was most important. Well, she said, well, Fred, I know you want to file a lawsuit and it's going to take some time. I said, that's right. But she said, this is so important, we need to get the community involved. Why don't we try to ask the black people to stay off of the buses on Monday, the day that Ms. Parks is going to be tried, as a protest. We didn't call it a boycott because I advised them on the fact that we have an anti-boycott statute and you can't boycott businesses without a legal excuse or just cause. I thought we had both of those, but I wanted them to be aware of it. And she said, well, if that's the case, and then she said, well, let's have them to stay off of the bus for one day. I said, well, suppose we were successful and they stay off of the buses for this one day. How are we going to keep them off of the buses for the rest of the time until this case is decided that we'll have to file? She said, well, we may make some plans. These are the plans we made. She said, one, we concluded that we're going to need, if we're going to ask them to stay off, we needed a spokesman who could tell our position and communicate with the opposition. We needed to have the leadership of the existing black community, and that was E.D. Nixon and Rufus Lewis. I've told you about E.D. Nixon. And in addition to that, and a spokesman, then we just might need a lawyer. But I said, well, let's look at, she said, well, let's start at the top. Who should we get? Well, I asked her as the spokesman. She said, well, that's easy, I can tell you. My pastor, Reverend Martin Luther King, haven't been here long, has not been involved in any civil rights activities, didn't come here for that purpose, but one thing he can do, he can move people by words. I said, fine. After that, I said, well, fine. After you get a spokesman, then we need to have a position for these two black leaders. E.D. Nixon was easy. He was a Pullman car porter. The president of his Pullman car porters union was Mr. Can't think of his name right now. I'll think of it in a minute. Up in New York, and he would be the person who would make he's the treasurer. A. Philip Randolph, that's his name. A. Philip Randolph is the Pullman car porters president of the union that E.D. Nixon was. Get hold of him. He'll help you raise some money. That'd be fine. Now, what about Rufus Lewis? Rufus Lewis owned a nightclub called the Citizens Club. And in order to be and get in that club, you had to be a registered voter. So that was fine.
That's a nice hook, I think, that we could do. Maybe you should
but
try
what does that have
some
to
of the
do
young people
with keeping people off of the buses? His wife, Jewel, was the co-owner of the largest funeral home black in Montgomery. Ross Clayton Funeral Home was the largest then and still is the largest funeral home. They have cars, they have drivers. They only need those cars when they have funerals. You get Rufus Lewis to be the chairman of the transportation committee. You'll get his wife and all the black leaders and their cars to help take these people where they're going. And you may need a lawyer, hear them out. Those were the plans that were made. It couldn't be told that Joanne was doing this because she would have lost her job at Alabama State. She lost it later on anyway, but she would have lost it earlier. And they would have disbarred me. They tried to do that later too. But we were able to pass the information on to the leaders. They got it to the proper authorities. When the buses ran on December the 5th, what happened? Very few black people were on it. Miss Parks was tried. We ended up, she was convicted. We appealed her conviction. There was a meeting of the black leaders at Mount Zion Church, at which time they adopted all of the plans that Joanne and I made in her living room, including they would have a meeting, and we had already decided that the meeting would be at Hope Street Baptist Church that evening. And when that evening was there, you couldn't get to the church. It was so crowded. And as I was sitting with Joanne and we listened to Dr. King speak, we knew then that the plans that we made were well on their way. And that's generally what happened.
And that boycott lasted
383 days.
And how did it come to an end? For 383 days, folks weren't on those buses. They were walking, they were using the cars, they did everything. 300, that's pretty remarkable.
It is
Well over a
remarkable.
year.
And almost every instance where this group is gone and other groups that we talk to all the time, you can almost find some connection between what Joanne Robinson and I did in terms of making the plans which were adopted by the officials, the blacks in Montgomery on December 5th, can be traced to, they said, well, if black people can solve their problems in Montgomery, and actually the bus boycott, as you know, didn't solve the problems. It was the case I later filed, Browder versus Gale, that solved them. But you can trace it back. And this museum that you're in now, you can see how the contributions, and we want to thank T.C. Coley for showing you that and all these other people, but it will show you the progress we've made. And if there was any place, and this gets a little farther than bus boycott, and I think in your letter to me, you talked about voter registration. Mm-hmm. Well, the persons who started the real drive for voter registration wasn't the Montgomery Bus Boycott. It wasn't the Selma to Montgomery March, but it was people in Tuskegee, Alabama, as far back as 1944, with Arthur Shores coming from Birmingham to Tuskegee, filing lawsuits so that black people could get the right to vote. Now, I've been telling people this for a long time, and I just happened to avoid. And one thing I did want to just show you, so that you know that this matter of voter registration, and that's the main thing that you were concerned about, because if you look at all these other things, and what our people over here realize, people at what was then Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University, and at the VA hospital, which was the only place at that time where black veterans could be treated, started right here in Tuskegee. And one of the graduates of Tuskegee University was a lady who came back, Gwen Patton. And Gwen Patton later worked for the community college, Trenton College in Montgomery. And in 1998, this is now a long time after the Selma to Montgomery March, she asked me to attend a luncheon on the March the 18th. I was telling people that while we have every year now, and I filed a lawsuit that made it possible so that you could have the Selma to Montgomery March after they called me and retained me on Bloody Sunday, and I filed it the next day. And as a result of that, we had the Voting Rights Act ended up being passed, and they had the Selma to Montgomery Trail. And from that time till now, I've been trying to get them to extend that trail from Montgomery to Tuskegee, because black people started the movement over here in '54. And this is what a part of what I mentioned to them. And these are some of the things that happened. On August 25th, 1945, a class action suit was filed against the Macon County Board of Registrars in the United States Federal Court for the Middle District of Alabama. Arthur Shores filed that lawsuit. At the same time, with leadership coming from Macon County, Alabama, 25 cases were filed in local state circuit courts for the purpose of having African Americans registered to vote. That's another thing that started right here in the city where you're sitting now. On November the 6th, 1953, 5 local residents filed a class action suit in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Alabama. And that was before Judge Johnson was on the bench. On February the 19th, 1957, Dr. C.G. Gomillion president of the Tuskegee Civic Association, which is the organization over here that caused all of these lawsuits to take place. And his picture is right back here. Dr. Gomillion's picture is, and later on the Gomillion versus Lightfoot, which is another great case. But it says that on February the 19th, 1997, Dr. C.G. Gomillion, as president of the Tuskegee Civic Association, filed a sworn statement with the chief counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee asking them about helping blacks over here to get registered to vote. Then in 1958, Gomillion v. Lightfoot, the city limits of Tuskegee used to be a square. But if you'll notice in the case, as over here in this corner, you will see it, and it was some 58 squares. So if there was any place where people can go and see, it's here. And I'm just so happy that you're here, and I could tell you a little something about it.
Well, I wanted to talk about that bus boycott some to set a stage, but now that we've kind of moved into the voting rights, and you mentioned filing the lawsuit to allow the Selma to Montgomery march that has gone through, that clearly all that happened here in Tuskegee was incremental help. Incremental change. And did you work on Gomillion versus Lightfoot?
It was my brainchild.
That's what I thought. That's why I asked you.
And nobody thought I could win it but me.
Explain exactly what the Gomillion case did.
In 1956 or 57, the senator, and of course all of them were white then, from Macon County, and you'd had all this efforts made by blacks trying to get registered. And it was at a point where a city election was coming up in Tuskegee, and if the blacks who were qualified were in fact voters, you would have a change in the racial composition of the jury. So they decided to change the city limits. The city limits was a square. I think it was 3 miles from the square, and the square is right up the street. And change this so that it would go out to include all the white people, come in to exclude all the whites, so that all of the blacks who lived in the city, except about 7 or 8, were excluded. And I thought that violated the Constitution. And when they talked to me and retained me representative, because I had done what I had done ever since the bus boycott. When I was retained the same time that Dr. King was retained, I knew I needed some help. And who did I call? I went and got the Justice of the former Justice of the Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall, who had been the lead counsel in Brown versus the Board of Education. He had read about the bus boycott, invited me to come to New York. I went to New York, and he assigned Robert Carter, who was then his chief assistant, and that's at the time before there was the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He was in charge of the NAACP. He says, we'll help you with this case. And not only did he say he'd help me with that case, but would help me with all the other cases that I've had, and I've had that type of relationship for them, the NAACP, plus the Legal Defense Fund from then until now.
The result of the Gomillion versus Lightfoot case, I mean, that was essentially a kind of a gerrymandering, drawing the line such that the black community was excluding from being able to vote. How did Tuskegee change? What happened when you won that case?
Well, of course, when we won it, of course, it meant that the whole racial composition of the city changed. And if you look over here, you'll see that change take place. You see a new beginning? Mm-hmm. That's where you have the first African Americans to serve. And later on, Johnny Ford became the mayor and was the mayor then for some 5, 6, or 7 terms. So it all started here.
And legally, they were all building blocks. Every case built on the other. Is that a fair statement?
That is correct, because the gerrymandering case was a very, very difficult case because there had been a case involving congressional districts, I think up in Michigan or one of those northern states. And Justice Frankfurter, who was on the court, had said, and he ruled against the people who, they were gerrymandering the cases. It really wasn't for race, I think it was for other reasons, political reasons. But he said that the matter of drawing the lines of municipalities or of districts is a political question and the courts would stay out of it. I had trouble getting Robert Carter to even agree to help me with the case, and I knew I would need some help. But he finally said, Fred, you go up and complain. I got to be in Houston, Texas on a certain day. You meet me out there and we'll see what we can do. Took him out there, took my little complaint, he agreed to do it. We filed the case, finally got it up in the court, and my position was I thought it violated both the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment of the Constitution. When we were having our little talk, there were some of the lawyers more experienced than I, because I was the youngest one on in there. But they finally accepted my argument that we'll take both. And when we got up to the Supreme Court, I had enough sense to realize when I was preparing the complaint, I asked William P. Mitchell, who was the executive secretary of the Tuskegee Syphilis Association, I said, you get me a map drawn to scale showing the old city limits and the new city limits. He got it for me. Didn't get a chance to use it, but I attached it as a copy to my complaint, so it was a part of the record. And when Judge Johnson ruled against us in that case, it was a part of the record. And when I got a chance to go and give our opening argument to the court, I brought with me under my arms my map. And I went up to the map, arranged with the officials of the court to set it up. As soon as I set it up and got up and started arguing it, and they had this, Mr. Justice Frankfurter, who we were all afraid of, says, counsel, what is that behind you? He didn't wait for me to explain it. I told him what it was, a map, and showed him this and that. He says, where is Tuskegee Institute? I pointed out, and I could show you on the map back there. He pointed out, here's Tuskegee Institute. He says, Tuskegee Institute is still in the city limits, isn't it? I said, Mr. Justice, it was in the city limits, but this act excluded Tuskegee Institute from the city limits. He said, Tuskegee Institute is not in the city of Tuskegee? I said, no, sir. I think that helped to win our case.
I think it did. I think it did. So I want to kind of talk a little bit. Clearly, I don't think people fully appreciate sometimes the fact that there were all of these lawsuits that you, Thurgood Marshall, Arthur Shores, and it's voting cases, it's gerrymandering cases, it's discrimination cases, whether it's with schools or whether it is with public facilities like the buses. How those built, I think, a platform for Congress to ultimately act with both the Civil Rights Act as well as the Voting Rights Act. But am I right? Is that?
Well, we were able to take all of those cases, and I think one of the things I mentioned as a part of this argument I made was the fact that when they had the first they had a Civil Rights Commission, and Dr. Gomillion testified at that commission. As a matter of fact, there's a picture back here that will show him, not Rufus Lewis, but William P. Mitchell, and a picture of me, because I submitted a report. All of these cases that had taken place up to that point became a part of the record that helped to pass the first Civil Rights Act. And of course, then later on, with the Selma to Montgomery March, you have the Voting Rights Act. But each one of the cases built on the other, but we are at a point now where if we're not careful, we could lose it all.
We're going to get to that. We're going to get to that in a moment. There were efforts, though, because I want to kind of talk a little bit. The Center for American Progress has been doing a lot of work on democracy, and particularly the filibuster in the Senate, and how the filibuster was used by so many, particularly segregation senators from the South, racist senators from the South, to block civil rights legislation, anti-lynching legislation. Can you reflect on that just a little bit? Because there had to have been discussions during all this time about pending legislation, trying to get Congress to act, that just got blocked each and every time.
Well, there's no question that was a real problem. And the good thing during the early stages of the civil rights movement is we had a Supreme Court who really was interested in protecting the constitutional rights and being sure that everyone, regardless of race, color, or creed, would be able to, one, get the right to vote, and two, enjoy all of the rights and privileges that any other citizen enjoys. And that court at that time did that. The bad part about that, as time has passed, and as you very well know, is that isn't the case now. And beginning with the case up in Chilton County.
Shelby County.
Shelby County,
Yeah.
not Chilton, the next one up. But that's a very serious matter. I'm not sure I can sit here and tell you the answer to it, but I can tell you that that is a major problem that really challenges whether or not we will maintain the democratic form of government as we have done in the past.
So after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, you know, I get the impression, and I was just kind of I was a kid at the time. I was 11, and and I think people often in across America and in both black and white communities said, okay, this will have the changes. We can rest now. We can rest. And I think a lot of people did. But there was progress in those years after the Voting Rights Act passed where people were registered, African Americans, including yourself. You were elected to the Alabama legislature. What year was that?
That was 1970.
1970.
I ran 4 years before. It came out that I had won. As a matter of fact, they had me in the New York Times a day or so after, indicating I'm named in the news. But when they said the absentee ballots from Barber County, and this was at the time George Wallace was the governor, they said that while I had won by some 300 and some votes, they said we lost by some 300 and some votes. But we didn't stop. And with the aid of students from Tuskegee Institute then, and you'll see part of that over here too, those students, they went down in those counties in '66 when Tom Reed and I ran, and instead of just one of us, 2 blacks were elected to the Alabama legislature for the first time.
And that pattern continued for a while.
That's right.
I mean, it did.
And that improved. But now, even in states that you would not normally think of, you have had some people who have been at the top who have been not advocating trying to have as many people as you can registered, but one who wants selective people not arrested, but elected, so that they'll be able to do whatever they want done and not what the Constitution says. So the struggle for equal justice under the law continues.
Did you handle cases, the Civil Rights Act, one of the strongest enforcement mechanisms that the Voting Rights Act was part of the Voting Rights Act was Section 5, the preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act, which required states like Alabama that had a history of discrimination to get Justice Department preclearance before they could do anything like that. Did you handle any of those cases in the time before Shelby County versus Holder, when it was kind of done away with?
Well, actually, before the Shelby case, we didn't have as much agitation there was to keep persons from being registered. There was, at some point along the way, I think people kind of thought that maybe black folks ought to have a right to vote, so we didn't have it. But as time passed and when people saw more and more blacks having political power in Alabama, the white power structure decided we need to do something about it. And I think that gave rise to the Shelby County case. I was not involved, as you know, in that case.
It's an interesting history and an interesting perspective from someone who has just literally lived it. That following the Voting Rights Act, there were changes, and there was an acceptance of voting rights and people registering to vote, and black officials like yourself in the legislature and in city councils and county commissions around the state and the country. And there weren't as many lawsuits because of that preclearance was one thing, I think, that prevented that, right?
Right.
But then all of a sudden, when you started flexing your muscles with some of this, power structures decided, no, we need to challenge that.
Yeah.
And that resulted in the Shelby County versus Holder case.
For example, to show you the various aspects, when I started practicing law over here in Macon County and moved from Montgomery here because I felt I could get a better chance of doing what I was trying to do, and that was to destroy everything segregated I could find. I could do that here. But then when I would go into court for a jury trial in a county with 80% blacks, and you have 100 people on your vernacular, and I see only one or two who look like me. So I filed a case, Mitchell versus Johnson against the Jury Commission, to take care of the jury problems that we had. Not only that, we also, of course, had the school problems. We had Brown versus Board of Education, and in 1963, that was in 1954, and in 1963, we still didn't have any schools in the state. So we filed school cases. I filed 5 desegregation school cases. One against Montgomery County, Barber County, Bullock County, Crenshaw County, and Macon County. And in all those cases, while the people there didn't, the power structure wanted, they were willing to do it. But in the case in Macon County, George Wallace decided that the Tuskegee High School, which is just a block from here, he sent the state troopers in, and you'll see that all over there. And when he didn't bother Montgomery County, didn't bother the other 4 counties, they went ahead. And I concluded if he could end up having the troopers to prevent segregation, or to enforce segregation on forces or prevent integration, then I could file a lawsuit, add him as a party, add the State Board of Education as a party, and ask him to ask the court to desegregate all the school systems in the state not under court order. Never been done anywhere since, not before it happened. And then I looked around and saw I had these lawyers from the government on the side, because Judge Johnson made them to be co-counsel for us representing the plaintiff. And then I found that there were other things that they were doing. One of which, the farmers, and this is a farm area, we had to file a lawsuit against the committee, the agricultural committee of each of the counties, who decided who got the subsidies. And we had such a case, Henderson versus Macon County ASCS. So we did that, we got the schools. And with all of these various things going on, the power structure in Alabama concluded that we've got to do something to stop it. And I think that while it helped us do those things, it hurt us in the sense of giving rise to that case up in Shelby County.
Well, Fred, you've lived, and you've been very generous with your time. We're not going to stay here too much longer, but you've lived this from almost the beginning. I mean, from the really after some things started to get going, you have been on the front lines. You have been that warrior for justice. You've seen you've seen the highs and some of the lows. And where are we now? Where do you think this country is now on both voting rights and civil rights?
I think we're probably at the most important stage in our history, because you have now people, some in high positions, who what they are saying and what they are doing is in effect saying that it's all right for us to discriminate against it as long as it's doing what we want to be done. So I think when you get people in high positions saying that, then the guy down here at the bottom said, well, if the man up here says that's good, then what am I going to do down here? And what we are seeing now is a part of that. And unless we are careful, we may not a few years from now have a democratic form of government in this country.
I think folks that I work with here at CALP, we would all agree with that. But we're going to be looking, what's the message? How can we stop that? We can talk about voter engagement. How do you get the young people engaged? How do you get citizens engaged on that right to vote that you fought so hard for? How can you get folks to exercise that?
Well, one thing about this whole thing, Doug, and what I have tried to do, I've tried to stick, let me say this first. There are so many people who have done so many different things in making the civil rights movement go. Just the legal aspect of it alone would not have taken place. But the legal aspect of it is where you're able to get the government to say, this is it. So, but you have to get people interested. So you're going to need to have somebody out there to study on it. You're going to have to get somebody to get people excited about it. So you're going to need the speakers. You're going to need the marchers. You're going to need the demonstrators. You're going to need all of these people doing these various things. And these are people who don't have law degrees. You will notice you don't see me in the marches. I only did about one ceremonial march, and I was a part from Selma, from St. Jude's School to the Capitol. My role was to do the legal role. And I have tried to do that and do it in the best way that I can. There are others who could do these other things. So I was not one other than I only planned one protest, and that was a protest with Joanne Robinson in connection with the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And I didn't tell anybody about that until many years later. But we're at a stage that I can't sit here. I can tell you what we did. I can tell you why I did it. We can see what others have been able to do as a result of what we did in the Montgomery Bus Boycott. But it's going to take all of us doing somewhat similar on a local basis to what the people in Montgomery did. Joanne and I did our part. We passed it on to the black leadership to do their part. They did their part, and it developed into the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And I remember there's an organization that puts out this U.S. Civil Rights Trail, and it just came out in March of this year, and the years for this year. And it has, and I did an interview for them in this same area, and a lot of As a matter of fact, the front page of that document happened to have me standing here where we are now. But the other thing it shows in there is a picture of Holt Street Baptist Church, which says at the top, it all started here. But the struggle continues. And I'm just happy that the men in the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, while we haven't talked about it, this whole museum has come about because they said to the president when he made an apology to them that we want a permanent memorial here. Over there you have all 623 of the name of those people under there. You see some of their pictures all there. They gave and they made a contribution, and this is what Mr. Shaw told the president, that they made a contribution to this country, even though they didn't know it, in the field of health care. And he says, we want a memorial and we want you to help us do it. We weren't able to get the type of money that some have been able to get, but I've gone out, we've made speeches, and the community and the country needs to know and needs to be able to see the Tuskegee Human and Civil Rights Multicultural Center, also known as the Tuskegee History Center, because it not only shows the contributions made by those as you have seen, but it gives a history of the struggle that African Americans have had from slavery to the present time, including about 5 cases filed by residents of this county that has not only helped them, but has helped many people across the nation. We are happy that you're here, and we're just so happy to be here. I don't think I acknowledged my wife, Carol, who we are second marriages, and we've been married now for 22 or 23 years, and she said she wanted to take care of me, and she's doing that. Thank you very much, Carol. And I want to thank the staff here for making it possible with only one paid employee, and to do it for 26 years. We need your help and need support from across the nation, because the people need to know and see where voting rights really started as far as the beginning for African Americans in this country.
Well, Fred, thank you. I can't tell you how honored I am to have been here, to be with you, to just listen, to be in your presence. On behalf of the Center for American Progress and so many people around this country and around the world, thank you for your life. Thank you for your legacy. Thank you for your works.
Thank you very much, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you.